how my father tried to cut me out of the inheritance. My name is Luca, and what I'm about to share is something I never thought could happen to my family. We were a normal family, or so I believed, until my grandfather's death uncovered dark secrets and family conflicts I never imagined existed. This isn't just a story about a contested inheritance. It's about deceit, lies, and shocking discoveries that forever changed my relationship with my father. It all began last year when my grandfather passed away suddenly. He was a strict but fair man, and while a part of me feared his judgment, I deeply respected him. He lived in an old countryside villa that he had built with his own hands in the 1950s. The house was enormous, with secret rooms, dusty attics, and a garden that seemed like it was from another century. For us grandchildren, it was a magical place, full of adventures and mysteries waiting to be uncovered. After his death, things initially seemed to go as expected. My father, his eldest son, was to handle everything with his siblings, Uncle Carlo and Aunt Angela. But soon I began to notice something strange. Whenever the inheritance was discussed, my father grew anxious as if he were hiding something. At first, I thought it was just grief over the loss, but I would soon realize there was much more to it. A couple of months after my grandfather's death, we received a call from the family lawyer. I still remember that moment vividly. Hearing that calm, detached voice on the other end of the line gave me chills. The lawyer said it was time to read the will, and we all had to meet. I had no idea what was about to unfold. The day of the meeting, the atmosphere at home was heavy. As I stepped into the lawyer's office, I immediately noticed how out of place my father seemed. Usually composed and in control, today he was different. His hands trembled slightly as he turned a coffee cup between his fingers. My mother, normally calm and steady, avoided everyone's gaze. Staring out the window as though facing the outside world was easier than being in that room. My uncles, typically talkative and relaxed, were unusually quiet. Uncle Carlo never lifted his eyes from the table, and Aunt Angela struggled to hide the tears glistening in her eyes. The entire room was suffused with an eerie silence, as if everyone were bracing for something they didn't want to face. I couldn't understand why everyone was so nervous. I thought it was just grief over my grandfather's passing, but beneath the surface, something much deeper was brewing, something on the verge of exploding. When the lawyer began reading the will, everything seemed to proceed as expected. My grandfather, the man who had built the villa with so much sweat and sacrifice, had left everything to his 3 children, my father, Uncle Carlo, and Aunt Angela, to be divided equally. It seemed like a generous and straightforward arrangement. But as the lawyer neared the end, his tone shifted suddenly. He mentioned a specific clause, and at that moment my mind raced and my heart pounded. I felt as though everything I knew was about to crumble. The lawyer continued, explaining that if any of the 3 siblings were to renounce their share of the inheritance, the house would go entirely to the one who remained. As soon as those words left the lawyer's lips, an icy chill swept through the room. Uncle Carlo, who had been silent up until that point, turned pale. His face became whiter than the paper the will was written on. Carlo, usually the calm and composed one, now seemed completely off balance. Aunt Angela, the most emotional member of the family, couldn't hold back her tears, and her trembling voice betrayed her frustration despite her attempts to hide it. The tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Everyone sat frozen in silence, but something about the situation didn't sit right with me. My father, however, didn't appear surprised. In fact, he seemed unnervingly calm. When the lawyer finished reading the will, he left us alone to discuss it. That's when everything exploded. Aunt Angela, unable to hold back any longer, was the first to speak. Her voice shook with anger and pain as she accused someone of tampering with my grandfather's wishes. My father lifted his gaze, trying to appear composed, but there was a palpable tension in his words. He insisted that he hadn't manipulated the will, claiming it was exactly how my grandfather had written it. His tone was an attempt to reassure, but it came off as hollow, almost rehearsed. It was as if he was hiding something, concealing a truth he didn't want anyone to uncover. That coldness in his tone sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't the father I knew. There was no apology, no vulnerability. Instead, his demeanor carried a shadow of something rotten, an unsettling presence in the room. His calmness felt calculated, and deep inside, I knew the truth was only beginning to surface. Uncle Carlo suddenly broke his silence, declaring that he didn't believe a word my father was saying. He turned to him and demanded to know what he was hiding, insisting that this version of the will couldn't have been written by my grandfather. My father stared at us all, unable to respond. His silence spoke louder than any words ever could. We knew then that he was hiding something. There was a truth no one wanted to face, but it was about to erupt with the force of a hurricane. The tension in the room became unbearable. No one spoke. I looked at my father, his cold, impassive eyes, and realized I was seeing a side of him I never wanted to know existed. Not only had he manipulated my grandfather, but now he was trying to manipulate his own family, his flesh and blood. As the silence deepened, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. This will wasn't just a legal document. It was a key that opened a chasm of hidden secrets and untold truths that would forever change our family's destiny. Weeks passed, and the tension in the family became suffocating. My father continued to dodge conversations about the villa, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from me. His cold demeanor, sudden silences, and calculated attempts to change the subject every time the house came up only heightened my suspicions. One night, while studying in my room, I heard voices coming from the living room. They were low, but I could make out enough to freeze me in place. My father was saying things like, "Secrets that must remain hidden," and "Don't let Luca find out." Those words echoed in my mind like a bell I couldn't unring. I couldn't stand by any longer. The next morning, while my father was at work, I made a decision that would alter everything. I waited until the house was quiet and crept into his study. The desk was a chaotic mess of papers and legal documents that immediately overwhelmed me with guilt and unease. But my curiosity, and the fear of remaining in the dark, pushed me forward. What was he hiding? Why didn't he want me to know the truth? I sifted through the mountain of papers for nearly an hour, my heart pounding in my chest. Then suddenly I found something different. A sealed envelope bearing the logo of my grandfather's law firm. My breath caught as I carefully opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, and as I read its contents, a chilling realization washed over me. The words my grandfather had written were clear and final. The villa was never meant to belong solely to my father. It was to be equally divided among his 3 children. But there was a hidden clause, a chilling footnote that stopped me cold. If a long-buried family secret ever came to light, the house would pass entirely to someone else. My father had lied. He had manipulated everything to keep that secret buried. But what was so devastating, so dangerous, that it could risk everything? I knew I couldn't confront my father directly without more evidence. So I decided to go to Aunt Angela. She had always been the most emotional in the family, but also the most truthful, never afraid to voice even the most painful realities. When I showed her the letter, her reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Tears welled up in her eyes, and the tremor in her voice hinted at the storm of emotions she was holding back. She told me she had hoped I would never find out this way, but now that it was out, there was no going back. And then she told me a story that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. Years ago, long before my father met my mother, he had a secret relationship with another woman. From that relationship, a child was born, a half-brother I never knew existed. When my grandfather discovered this, he insisted that the child, this unknown sibling, be included in the will and have a rightful claim to his inheritance. But for reasons Angela couldn't fully understand, my father had gone to great lengths to bury this truth, erasing all traces of the child's existence. Her words left me breathless. A brother. I had a brother, a part of our family my father had tried to erase as though he had never been born. And now, he was willing to manipulate my grandfather's will, his legacy, just to keep that secret from being revealed. I couldn't stay silent any longer. The indignation and rage burned inside me, and I knew it was time to confront my father. But I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed support. I asked Uncle Carlo and Aunt Angela to be present, not just to back me up, but to witness the truth unfold in its entirety. The next evening we gathered at my house. The atmosphere was thick with tension, every breath heavy with anticipation. My father didn't expect to see his siblings there, and the moment his eyes landed on the letter in my hand, his expression shifted. His face turned pale, his features betraying a mix of surprise and fear. I asked him why he had hidden all this from me, why he had tried to manipulate the will, to exclude a part of our family, just to bury a secret that concerned us all. He stood motionless, staring at me without uttering a word. Then slowly he lowered his gaze. For the first time, I saw a flicker of shame in his eyes. "It's not that simple," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "There are things you wouldn't understand." But I wasn't willing to accept his excuses anymore. The room was silent, all eyes on him as he struggled to find the words. His voice broke as he confessed the truth, that he had been young, foolish, and afraid of how the world would judge him and the family. But no justification could erase what he had done or the pain his actions had caused. In that moment, I realized our family would never be the same. My father's betrayal wasn't just a matter of inheritance or property. It was a fracture that revealed how fragile trust can be. It exposed the lengths people will go to protect themselves, even at the cost of those they hold dear. This wasn't just about a house or a will. It was about uncovering the hidden scars of a family and deciding whether those wounds could ever truly heal. I told him I had discovered I had a brother he had tried to hide, a brother he had lied about for years. At those words, my father closed his eyes, as if I had just dealt him a painful blow. Then, with an almost resigned tone, he began to speak. He told me it was true that I had a brother named Marco who lived in a distant city and didn't know about me or who we really were. He had tried to keep him from discovering the truth for the sake of our family. I was speechless. All those secrets, that deceit, was it all out of fear? Aunt Angela turned to my father and asked why all this, when their father had wanted Marco to be part of our lives. My father shook his head, his eyes full of remorse. He told us he was afraid my mother would leave him and the family would fall apart. He regretted the choice he had made. In that moment, I realized I was looking not just at my father, but at a man who had been overwhelmed by his own mistakes and fears. I glanced at Uncle Carlo, who was staring at our father with an unusual coldness. He told him that his fears didn't justify his actions, that he had denied me a part of my life and Marco a family. I felt a surge of emotion and anger rise within me. I had an incomplete family, secrets stolen from me without any choice in the matter. In that instant, I knew things would never be the same again. But there was something more. Another buried truth my father hadn't yet found the courage to confess, and it was perhaps the hardest one to accept. Marco, that forgotten half-brother, wasn't just a secret from the past, a youthful mistake my father hoped to erase. The situation was far more complex and painful. Marco was ill, gravely ill, and this health issue wasn't news to my father. A few months before my grandfather passed away, he had discovered Marco's difficult situation. Despite everything, my grandfather had remained the kind of man who wanted to care for his loved ones. Even that grandson he barely knew but understood was part of the family. That's why my grandfather had chosen to include Marco in the will, not just to make up for my father's silence, but also to ensure Marco had a less uncertain future. Due to his illness, Marco was unable to work steadily and would require constant financial support to cover the inevitable medical treatments as his condition worsened. My father, however, had tried to make all of this disappear, and now I understood why. He had decided that Marco's problems weren't his to bear, that he didn't want to take responsibility for a son he had never acknowledged, a son who represented a past life he was ashamed of. But the reasoning didn't stop there. The selfishness went even deeper. He feared that the medical expenses, care, and weight of Marco's illness would drain our resources, take something away from me and my family, or cast a shadow over the perfect life he had desperately tried to maintain in the eyes of others. And now, looking at him in that moment, I no longer saw the man I thought I knew. I saw someone who had made petty choices, not to protect our family, but to safeguard his pride, his power and control over a situation that was slipping out of his hands. I realized that to him, Marco wasn't a person of flesh and blood with a future and a life worth preserving. He was just a burden, a threat, an inconvenient secret he had tried to bury in the shadows, and that burden now rested squarely on us.